Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from Electronic Armory. In this 3D game development video, we'll be unwrapping our character so we can apply a skin or material with a texture to our character's mesh in order to give it some personality and differentiate it between non-player characters and the player's character and enemies. We'll then import our new character into Unreal Engine so that we can move it around, activate its different animations for idling, walking, running, and much more like we did in the previous video. So subscribe to the channel to get notified as I put out videos, jump into the Discord, link below to get help on your own projects, but let's get started. Alright, where we left off in the last video as animating our walking and idling cycles, we're going to unwrap this character so that we can apply a texture material to the character, and what we're going to be building is a Minecraft-like character. So this is a very simple mesh, but it should illustrate some of the more complex and advanced features of UV unwrapping and texture mapping some of those different pieces. And we'll bring that texture into Photoshop and apply what basically will look like a Minecraft character. So to start that off, I'm going to go over to the UV editing menu up at the top here, and I'm going to zoom in our image here as well. And I'm going to do that same thing over on the right-hand side, so that we can start to unwrap our character. So right now we're in the armature's edit mode, so I'm going to get out of that first, and then we can concentrate on the mesh. I'm going to hold down the D key and right click just to erase some of our annotations there. Alright, so once that's removed, we're going to go into the properties for our armature, and under viewport display, uncheck in front like we did in the last video. Alright, so now we have our mesh here. We can select the different pieces of the mesh by going into edit mode, hit tab, and we're going to go into edit mode, and we're going to essentially define where we want the pieces of the UV map to wrap around, and also how we want that to cut into the different pieces of the mesh. So for example, if you picture a piece of wrapping paper, and you want to apply that over top of a gift, such as a box, how would you go about doing that? So you would take the flat piece of paper, let's say it's like this, and you would fold it over this crease, and then it would wrap onto that back face that we can't see, and then this piece would go in between his body and the arm, and then this piece right here would go into the front of the arm. So that's essentially what we're going to need to do. However, we don't want to forget about the top piece of the arm and the bottom piece of the arm. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a bottom slice down here and another top piece up here so that we can wrap this around. So essentially, like we covered in a previous video, UV unwrapping is taking a flat image and how that gets wrapped or applied to the different pieces of our mesh. And now you can see with my mesh selected, you may have noticed on the left-hand side what these UVs kind of look like, and it's pretty much a mess. So on the left-hand side, if we put our mouse cursor over one of these and hit L, it will select that piece that we can then hit G and move that around. All right, but we don't know which piece this is because it also looks very similar to this piece and very similar to this piece, and it gets really confusing what this is actually representing. But these are certainly not the pieces that we want to use. So we're going to manually unwrap all of this stuff. But before we begin, we're going to set up our environment. We're going to go over to our UV menu, and we're going to select Live Unwrap, and that will enable live unwrapping. Now on the right hand side, we can hit Alt-A to deselect everything, and then where my cursor is, hitting the L key, select that particular UV island, which is what we call this grouping of UVs. We can also go back to the right here. I'm going to hit 3 and go into face select mode, and I can just select this particular face. And you can see that this particular UV represents the face. And actually, to confirm that that is the face, I'm going to hit 1 on my number pad and just make sure that I'm looking at the front of our character as opposed to maybe the back side, because they're very symmetrical. Okay, so our head is part of the default cube, which actually has its own UV unwrapping, and so we can kind of explore what this looks like. The top of the head, it appears, is on the right, the front is way up here, the right hand side is down, the left-hand side is way over here. So we're actually going to unwrap this, but what we are going to essentially have is the same orientation of our UVs here, but I'm going to make it make a little bit more sense when we go ahead and put this into Photoshop, and we're going to color on top of this to draw the face, the hair, etc. for his head. So I want this first face, so let me go and select the face here, and what I'm going to do then is hit 2 on my keyboard so that I can go into edge select mode. Now in the game, we're mostly going to be seeing our character from the back. And so what we need to do is cut into our mesh here different seams that essentially that wrapping paper that I mentioned before is going to wrap around, and we're going to have seams because that flat piece of paper needs to be cut up into a shape that kind of looks like, not that, but if I hit on here, like this. And so if you imagine cutting out a piece of paper like this, if you guys have ever cut out a piece of white paper and then folded these corners up to make a cube, that's essentially what we need to do for UV unwrapping. But we need to cut these out, kind of doing it in reverse. We got to start with the mesh and then cut it out so that it looks like this. So where my cuts are going to be, I'm going to select those. Let's get rid of our annotation here. I can hit N, go to View, Annotations, and either just delete it or hide it. Hit N again to get rid of that. All right, so we'll see that this is going to be, if I draw on here, we kind of want that bottom face here. So that's what that represents, this U shape in my seams. And then I want this to cut out like here, so that that'll be the left side of my face. And so we want this to come up, and this is going to be the top, which is going to be here. And so you can see that this is still attached, so we are not going to create a seam here. But for the back face, or the back of the head, we do want that seam there because there's no connecting UV here. So I'm going to also select this part. And then going back to the left-hand side, this edge does not also have a UV connected to it, so we can create a seam there. And so this U here is represented by this U as well. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of how we're going to cut this out. I'm going to do the same thing on this side so that we have this piece. And then again, we're going to have the top piece, the back piece, which is this one, and then there's a bottom piece under the neck, which is going to represent this piece. But I'm going to keep that UV connected, and we've already made seams around the bottom piece. So the bottom piece has a seam here, a seam here, and a seam here, and it's connected here. So you can see the seam here, 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 and it's connected there. So hopefully that makes sense to you. But in order to actually make these seams, we're going to hit Control E, or you can go up into the Edge menu. Same thing, so Control E, and then go down to Mark Seam, and I'm going to deselect those by hitting Alt A, and you can see that those are now red, representing our seams. Now if I hit L to select just this piece, let me hit 3 on my keyboard first, then L, you can see that this is the original UV, and you might not actually have UVs defined depending upon what mesh you're trying to unwrap, but we're going to unwrap those explicitly. So with your mouse cursor over the viewport here on the right, hit U for UV unwrap, and we can just go ahead and try the first option because we've already cut out everything manually. Now if you're trying to do a little bit more complex and you wanted Blender to do it for you, you can try to do Smart UV Project or some of these other options, but we're doing it manually, so we'll do unwrap, and you can see that this is a pretty interesting orientation that it's chosen for us. A seam here if you don't do it appropriately. So you have to match up pixel for pixel so you don't see the image on the left here and the right. So you have to match that up. However, because this is a simple model, it won't really matter. All the colors will be kind of matching anyway. Okay, so we have our cross here. So here's our cross, and it goes down. And then it'll continue down here and wrap around. So I think I got everything. Let's give it a shot. I'm going to select the whole entire mesh, with, make sure 3 is selected, so we do face select mode. Hit L, it'll select this whole thing. And by default, this UV map is pretty terrible. You can see it's overlapping. If I grab this, it's connected to a couple of different vertices here. Actually, this edge, and then these 2 edges are also connected to one vertex. So that's a problem. Okay, so I'm going to actually undo that so I get my selection of my edges back. So just undo until we have our edge selection back, because I forgot to do Control E, mark seam. Okay, so you can do that one seam at a time, or what I find is better is just select all the seams at the same time so you can kind of see them and then mark the seam. Now I'm going to hit L to select that entire thing, and now when we UV unwrap it, it will give us this orientation. Okay, and so you can kind of see that the top face here is in the middle and the bottom would be here, and so we just kind of have to like, this is the front of the face, so I'm going to actually rotate this in the opposite direction. So again, select all of your mesh, all the faces of the mesh on the right hand side, and then we can select everything on the right or left, excuse me, and then hit R and hold down Control to orient it appropriately. Okay, and we can scale it, of course, if we want to. We'll wait to do that here in a second. I'm going to undo that for right now because we want to do the other arm. So it's the same exact process. Let me do that really quickly, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, make sure you have all the edges selected. Control E, mark seam, L over your mesh, and U unwrap. Okay, so we get the same orientation. I'm going to hit the front face with 3 first, make sure we're in face select mode, and we can see that this is the front face. So I'm going to use that, hit L to select all of my arm pieces, A on the left hand side, R, hold down Control so we snap, and there we go. Alright, so I mentioned before that we had the 2 arms. I'm going to hit L to select that other arm, and you can see that they're actually on top of each other. And that might be okay for having a texture map, but when Unreal Engine wants to create the light maps for it, it will actually complain about these 2 UVs being on top of each other. And what I mean by that is if we hit Alt-A and then L on one of these, we can drag one using the G key, and you can see that they're on top of each other. Again, it will use the UV map to generate the light maps. So what we would have to do if we want to do that, say we want to use the same colors and texture for both arms and maximize the use of our texture space, then we can do this. We'd also have to create a light map, and that's great to do. Blender actually has a built-in function for doing that kind of thing. So if you want to see that kind of thing in a future video, leave a comment down below and I'll be more than happy to cover it. But for right now, we're actually going to move these side by side, and to keep them in line, I'm going to hit the X key and just keep it on the X and move it over, hit A, move it over again using the X key, and kind of center these a little bit, and then we're going to scale these so that they fit in the UV. I'm not going to worry too much about it because we have a whole bunch of other UVs to unwrap to try to fit within this texture space. So I'm going to quickly unwrap the other cubes here. This goes pretty quickly because it is just a bunch of cubes. We unwrap it in the same exact way, but I'll speed that up so you don't have to sit through that, and we'll see you on the other side. Okay, so I made a small mistake and I actually marked these as seams, and so you might have seen in the menu we can clear those seams. So I said it would be easy, but there we go. So we cleared those seams and we should be good to unwrap this piece. Okay, then I'm going to do both legs at the same time. Alright, so we've basically unwrapped everything here. So if I hit A over on the right hand side here, you can see all of the UVs. Now right now they're pretty much a mess, so if we wanted to, we can select everything, go over to the UV menu and say pack islands, but you'll see that it kind of puts them into a weird orientation, and I don't necessarily want that. I can also say average island scale, and that will kind of keep it relatively sized for the different cubes. However, the way that I originally did it is okay. We just have to manually orient these, and that might be your process. You might want to have Blender do it. It just really depends on kind of what you're trying to accomplish. But for us, we're going to bring this into Photoshop. So I want my orientation to kind of make sense a little bit. So we're going to kind of orient these UVs on the left-hand side with what kind of looks like the orientation on the right, obviously splayed out for representing the arm, the head, etc. So in order to do that, I'll do a couple and then I'll speed up the video. I'm going to hit Alt-A to unselect everything, and we're going to hit L on this guy, and you can always see which part that is by hitting L on the right hand side. So this is obviously our head. So what I'm going to do is, because I only have one head, I'm just going to scale this down and get it relatively close to kind of where I think it needs to go. And because we have two arms, L and hit L again, we have these two arms. We can scale these, hit A to select them and then scale them. So I have that now. And of course, they're probably going to want to be a little bit farther apart. So I'm just going to keep them on the same x-axis. Hit L, oops, deselect it first, hit L, G, X to move it over. And there we go. So now with the head and the arms, that's looking okay right now. We're going to get into a little bit of an issue with the body, because once we select the body, you can see that it's kind of in the middle there. But that's okay. We can select all, drag it down and hit Y to constrain it to the Y, and put it right about maybe here. And then we're going to get the legs in. So let me select those legs. A to select all, drag those down. I'm going to scale them so they fit, and I'm going to also make sure that they are kind of in a different spot. So everything should lay out nicely. All right, so we could do this all with all the UVs showing, so we can do it that way. And so now that I kind of know where the orientation is, so I know that this is the head, this is the body, this is the arm left and right, and then these are the legs, I can now get a better sense of how these should be laid out. So you want to maximize the texture space that you're using. And that's not always the easiest thing to do, so it just takes a little bit of experience, a little bit of experimentation, and we can get these to kind of, again, fill up as much of the texture space as possible. The more texture space that these occupy, the more detail that we can have within our model. So if they're only taking up a little bit of space, then you won't get that much data in there. And I like to move the legs and arms together, so I'm going to move these down a little bit. You don't want to get too close to the edge. Maybe I'll make the head a little bit smaller and move that up. Okay, and again, just play around with it until you get something that fills up the most space. And again, this could be a little bit of a tedious process, but we'll just leave it here as is. So again, we have the front of the leg here, and that's actually upside down in this case, so good thing I checked that. But we're going to hit L and hit L again, and then what we can do is rotate these, but then they'll be on the wrong side. So what we're going to go up to is this one and do individual origins, and then we can rotate these 180. Click, and now they just spun like two propellers. Hit G and Y to keep them on the texture space. And again, our front leg, oh actually this one is on the left hand side, that one's on the right hand side. Okay, let me undo that. So I was just double checking to make sure that, again, if we're bringing this into Photoshop, that we want these orientations and everything to make sense. So I'm going to actually undo the flip, and then I'm going to put this back to where it was. Make sure your cursor's over here. And now when we flip it 180 and move it up on the Y, that our left leg front is here, our right leg front is here, and again, that should match up. Yep, there's the bottom, there's the face. So here's the bottom of the body, here's the face. And let me just check the arms. Okay, our arms are backwards as well, and that's fine. So I'll show you how to do that again. and we're going to select all those, rotate those 180, and so the front is there, and actually we're going to rotate those on its origin, so those got flipped around. So individual origins, and then when we flip them, they'll go like propellers. And again, this is the front, these are the back. This should be the left-hand side of the left hand. Yep, perfect. Or right arm, or arm, excuse me. And then this should be the right side of the right arm. Okay, perfect. So looking at the front face of our character, you can kind of see how this will map out. All right, so hopefully you're still with me. Let's take this into Photoshop, and the best way to do that is to go up to the UV menu, go down to Export UV Layout, select a name for the UV. So I'm going to actually make, this is my character, so I'm going to call it Character UVs. It is a PNG file. So what it'll basically be is an outline of the UVs with a transparent background so we can start coloring it in. All right, let's go over Photoshop and fill these all in. All right, so navigate to where we have our character UVs, and you can see what our character is supposed to look like. So we're going to use that as our model. All right, so again, this is our body, this is our face, these are our arms, these are our legs, if you can see where my cursor is. And again, we're going to try to create something that looks like this guy. So you can see his legs are kind of a purplish blue. I'm going to actually use the color grabber, hit the I key, and just grab some color. You can see it's a shade of different colors, but that's okay. And again, these are his legs, so I'm going to hit the B key for the brush. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller and just kind of color in, color in this. I forgot one step though. This layer is the layer that we have for our UVs. I'm going to make sure I create another layer. So make sure we name that appropriate. I'm just going to call it UVs. And then this is going to be our drawing layer. Feel free to create as many layers as you need to, but we're just going to go ahead and do a really quick pass over these guys to color it in. You'll see what I am trying to do here. This is not a tutorial on Photoshop, but we'll get this going. So I'm going to go ahead and color in the legs. All right, and we can drag the UV layer on top so we can still see that we are coloring where those faces in our mesh would be. All right, let's grab his body color. Can hit the I key, grab that color, go back, and then color in his body. And make sure you have your appropriate layer selected. Okay, so there's the body. I'm being purposely messy here. You can be as neat and tidy as you want to. We do want to make sure that there's a little bit of bleed over around these edges. We don't want any pixels that are blank because they'll definitely show up in our model. Okay, so let's get the color for his arms. We can see that the top of his arms are still that green color, and then the bottom is the skin color. So I'm going to hit X to switch to the other color and then grab that skin tone. And then, as you recall, this is the top of his arm. And so what we can actually do for this one is grab the rectangle tool, and using that other color, so hit X, that green color, I can make a box, and that way the top of his arm will be blue, his sleeves all around. Maybe it's not perfect, but you can make a perfect cube. Let me do that again. So I can drag my cube here and then hold the shift to make a perfect cube, and just kind of, I'm going to eyeball that for this purpose, but this is a smart object, so we're going to go back to the layers down here, and we're going to say rasterize the layer. There it is, and you can see how that works. And if you want to, we can just copy that and then paste it in there, hit the V key, and color in the other arm. Now I'm going to combine all these. I'm going to hit Control E to combine the layers, and again, create as many layers as you want to, but we're going to then hit X to go back to that skin tone, and I'm actually going to create a layer under this because I want to color the arm, and I already colored the sleeve. So just and so you can see all this other data that is in between the arm is essentially wasted. So that's why we want to make sure that the texture space is being utilized as much as possible. So really we're only utilizing maybe half of this. And you can see with the different layers, because this layer is underneath the sleeve, that I can color right underneath it, and it works fine. Keeps that nice tight seam for the sleeve. Okay, so I colored over a little bit. That's why you want to leave a little bit of space between your UVs, so that as you get a little bit too close to this, it doesn't really matter. Alright, so I'm going to combine those layers now that everything looks good. And now for the face. I'm going to show you a little trick here. You might not want to use it, but at least you'll know it's available. I am going to take this face, and even though it is at an angle, I'm going to copy this, go back over to my character, hit paste in here, and I'm going to move that up. It's on its own layer right now. And the bottom, remember the bottom square here is his face. And I'm going to hit Control T and scale this down to kind of fit within that space. Now again, you might not want to do this, you might want to do it by hand, but I just wanted to show you that this is possible. If we hit the Control key and we move these little boxes, we can actually skew this to give a different orientation to that face. And Photoshop does a pretty good job of matching that up for us. Once you're done, hit enter, and you can see it looks, you know, not too bad. It's on its own layer, so I can go ahead and delete the parts that fall outside of that main UV. Alright, I'm going to create a layer on top of it to merge down later, and I'm going to grab his hair color and just start coloring in the hair. Maybe that'll be the top part of his head. And remember that this left side of the right part is the top of his head. So as we fold this back in, you'll see that. So if you want that crisp line like you have over here on the right hand side, then you would have to duplicate that. But it's Minecraft, so it's a pretty easy thing to just draw straight lines. But I'm going to get pretty messy with this so we can finish this up. Okay, so let's take a look at what this monstrosity we've created looks like. I'm going to merge down my layers, and I'm going to hide the UV layer, and it looks pretty atrocious, but that's okay because it's only going to use the parts that are defined by the UV. So I'm going to export this, but before I do that, I'm going to turn off those UVs so that we don't see them because we don't need them, and I'm going to export this as a PNG file, and I'm going to put that into the same Blender folder, and then I'm going to re-import that into Blender. Okay, looks like I spelled character wrong, but that's okay. So under character, I'm going to do an extension on this called COL for color, and this is going to be kind of our color map. Now back in Blender, what we can do is now take that image that we had in Photoshop and then put it in on the left-hand side. So if you go to Open, it'll open a dialog. We can select that color map, zoom out a little bit, and using the UVs that we have in here, you can see what this looks like. Now if I go to the rendered mode or material preview, you'll see that it's not showing anything. So if you remember from previous videos, we go to shading, and again this is our material, we hit Shift A, we can go to texture, image texture, and then we've already loaded that image into Blender, so we just have to drop this down, hit character color or COL, and then drag the color data into our base color, and you can see there's our Minecraft character. Now when I drew that initial square, you can see what's happening with our corners here. I didn't get that to be a perfectly centered square. So if I turn on the UVs again, you can see that it looks like this is skewed to the right a little bit. So that's where we're getting that kind of error. So take your time with it. Make sure your UVs are mapped appropriately. You might actually want to unwrap this in a different way if this is something that's going to cause you a problem, because you want this to be seamless, right? These lines to be seamless. So just something to keep in mind. Our face looks okay. You can actually see what happens when we create these seams. I did not color the like we have a few pixels that are not being fully utilized. So if we go back to the Photoshop and I zoom in here, you can see that there is a little bit of data that's missing. And so it's very important that we handle that. So I'm going to select that brown color and maybe reduce my brush a little bit. And it's okay to go over. Again, you might kind of want to do a better job than I'm doing. But again, it's just illustrating that fact that we spend a little bit of time making that perfect. I'm going to overwrite the old file. And then we can reload this. Okay, I'm going to save that file. I'm going to hit the space bar. Okay, so right now he's in the idle pose, and if you remember from the last video, we can go in the animation. We can select our action editor, choose a different animation, namely the walk cycle. Go over to pose mode if we select the bones first. Select the armature first, and then go to your walking pose, and that way hit Alt-H to show that again. And now we can switch back to the walking animation, which is only 40 frames long, so let's loop that. Alright, so then we can show the material preview in this one, and we can see our character walking, and again we can switch it over to the idle pose and watch him idle. So that's the basics of unwrapping our character with animations, and now it's all ready to go into Unreal Engine. So we'll do that in the next video. We'll move our character around, we'll activate the different animations using a state machine, and we'll have that state machine activate the idle, the walking, running, and much, much more. So I hope you found this video useful. If you'd like to see other 3D game development content, subscribe to the channel. We also have videos on Android, iOS, web development, and more. Thanks. We'll see you next time.